Is everyone ready? We affirm our sole contention is crisis averted. Martinuck at the University of New Zealand in 2019 finds that although Venezuela's economy was slowing prior to sanctions, U.S. sanctions alone have created a full-fledged humanitarian crisis by cutting Venezuela off from international markets. Specifically, U.S. sanctions have caused this crisis in three key ways. Subpoint A is oil turmoil. Rodriguez, 18 of Foreign Policy, finds the recovery of world oil prices should have given Venezuela more money to pay for its imports and facilitate an economic recovery. But due to American economic sanctions, the exact opposite happened, as imports fell by 31% during the exact same year. Since America was its largest buyer, Paraga 19 of Reuters explains that Venezuela's oil exports sank 40% in the first full month of American sanctions. Additionally, The Economist in 2019 finds that companies now charge large premiums because of the risk of exposure to U.S. sanctions, costing Venezuela 30% more for oil transactions. Overall, Weisbrod, the Center of Economic Policy Research, writes that after sanctions, Venezuela's oil production fell at 3 times the rate it had fallen before then. As a result, Emersberg 18 of Venezuelan Analysis quantifies that in 12 months, sanctions uniquely cut oil revenues by $6 billion, representing 6% of Venezuela's total GDP. Low oil revenues are devastating. The CEPR in 2019 notes that because the government relies on oil revenues to subsidize the cost of food and medicine for the poor, sanctions have decreased access to critical aid. Matane of the Gray Zone in 2019 warns that maintaining sanctions will cause food shortages, threatening 100,000 lives. Subpoint B is ending the aid blockade. U.S. sanctions are critically blocking aid from entering the country, as Erickson at the University of Chicago in 2019 explains that medicines such as insulin has stopped flowing into Venezuela because 1. U.S. pharmaceutical sanctions prevent U.S. pharmaceutical businesses from actually selling the drugs to the Venezuelan government, and 2. U.S. banks are forced to refuse payments for the medicine from Venezuela. This is disastrous, as the Venezuelan analysis quantifies that over 450,000 diabetics are on the brink of death. Fortunately, Wilfred of Brookings finds that ending sanctions would allow medicine to flow into the country, saving thousands of lives. Subpoint C is quenching thirst. Prior to sanctions, Marco 19 writes water access was stable throughout Venezuela, but maintaining the flow of water in Venezuela takes work. As Contreras in 2019 writes that due to old and deteriorating water infrastructure, Venezuela requires new foreign-built parts for water pumps and pipes. Unfortunately, sanctions have prevented this, as Fox of the DW in 2019 finds that since the United States has imposed sanctions, it has been impossible to buy pumps in order to repair infrastructure, as sanctions have blocked companies from selling them to Venezuela. Now facing deteriorating water infrastructure, there is no way to import foreign-built parts, as the Washington Post in 2019 quantifies that 20% of the population now lacks water, specifically due to economic sanctions. Without access to clean water, people take desperate measures, as Hernandez finds that people have now turned to muddy streams and sewer water, causing a surge in diarrhea, typhoid fever, and hepatitis. Consequently, Conan the CIS from 2019 externalizes that due to a lack of water, infant mortality has risen 6-fold, and that 1 million people are at risk of contracting waterborne diseases due to a lack of clean water. Lack of water has started an epidemic, as The Guardian in 2019 explains the diseases have started to spread into Colombia, Brazil, and Florida due to an increased migration, which will reverse 18 years of continent-wide public health gains if Venezuela does not solve its water crisis. Overall, Sadaf 06, the World Bank, explains that access to water acts as a prerequisite to economic growth because a lack of water prevents Venezuela from transitioning to more effective sectors like agriculture and denies people basic human needs. Because U.S. sanctions have created a worse humanitarian crisis, we affirm.
Can I see one piece of evidence?
Yeah.
I see that 20% of people lack water due to sanctions.
Yeah.
And can I see that they can't buy pumps and parts and it's impossible to fix it because of sanctions?
Yeah.
That was 10 seconds.
What else do you want to see?
Like they're buying pumps and stuff now, but it's impossible to fix with sanctions. We negate. Our first contention is Judgment Day. Even before sanctions were in place, the state of Venezuela's economy was deplorable. Rendon in 2019 explains the root cause of economic crisis wasn't sanctions, but rather President Maduro's abhorrent policies. Way before U.S. sanctions, Venezuela was suffering from 800% hyperinflation, massive export failure, malnutrition, and the exodus of 2 million people. Indeed, Escobar in 2019 corroborates Maduro has been committing a, quote, silent massacre of his own people. 91% of Venezuelans live in poverty, 90% go to bed hungry, and there's been a 100-fold increase in neonatal deaths. Fortunately, economic sanctions give the people of Venezuela hope, cutting off the root cause of the crisis in 2 ways. First is ending the gold rush. Currently, Delgado in 2019 explains, Maduro has turned to selling gold in order to create a direct stream of revenue for maintaining power. Additionally, Holmes in 2019 finds Maduro uses gold to buy loyalty from the military. However, Rod in 2019 finds sanctions choke out Venezuela's gold industry. Cornyn furthers that because U.S. sanctions have prevented Venezuela from buying imports in cash, Maduro pays in gold, depleting reserves 18.5% in less than a year. Second is persistence pressure. The U.S. Treasury Department in 2019 reports the U.S. is using sanctions against military generals to create incentives for opposing Maduro. Results are starting to show, as Delgado finds that key members of Maduro coalition are beginning to look for an exit strategy because business tycoons want to see him gone. For these 2 reasons, the EFE in 2019 finds the Venezuelan military has already begun to internally crack. NPR contextualizes, 1,000 troops have already turned and 90% of troops secretly oppose Maduro. Importantly, Stratford from 2019 confirms that Maduro's exit is on the horizon. The longer we are of sanctions, the higher chance he is removed. This is why Latin Risk Report in 2019 finds an 80% chance that we'll see Maduro fall by the end of this year. With Maduro gone, the EFE reports Venezuela can finally undergo a democratic transition. This would give the 27 million people currently suffering poverty a chance out of it. However, even if sanctions don't completely take out Maduro, they force serious change. The Economist in 2019 finds sanctions have pressured Maduro to retreat from socialism, eliminating almost all price controls. Moreover, the Washington Post adds, Maduro has cut the inflation rate from 7 to 6 digits. For all these reasons, Lopez 19 concludes, the Venezuelan economy is projected to grow 4% this year. There's even more potential. As Burt finds, the last time Venezuela went through economic reforms, extreme poverty fell by 65%. Unfortunately, voting pro would undo all of this, as Virgie in 2018 writes, lifting sanctions would act as reward for the Venezuelan dictatorship riddled with autocracy and corruption. But overall, Morgan in 2009 concludes, when the effects are severe, sanctions are effective 94% of the time. Our second contention is Independence Day. Without sanctions, the U.S. would be forced to take military actions in Venezuela for 3 reasons. First is replacement. Historically, Trump considered military action against Maduro, but instead decided to pursue economic sanctions. Masters in 2019 furthers, the U.S. sees sanctions as a replacement to military intervention. Second is oil. Roche in 2019 writes, a crucial ulterior motive of U.S. economic sanctions on Venezuela is to gain control of the oil market. Sanctions as the U.S. choice of doing so. As Ward in 2019 finds, prior to sanctions, Trump threatened a military option because Trump perpetually believes Venezuela has an abundant amount of easy access to oil. Third is 2020. Smiley in 2019 finds it has been 95 years since a Republican won the election without picking up Florida. Critically, Trump has made progress by increasing pressure on Venezuela, appealing to diverse Hispanic groups. Siddiqui in 2019 specifies, Florida is expected to be extremely close in 2020, leading Trump to take an aggressive stance on Venezuela, imposing harsh sanctions. Additionally, Grope writes, Florida is one of the few states where foreign policy is a key voter, and thus Trump and his advisors have put all options on the table when considering what type of hardline stance to take against Venezuela. However, because Trump has considered all options, Pelagia Cia in 2018 finds, given sanctions are not the U.S. weapon of choice on Venezuela, the alternative would be a military intervention. Overall, intervention has a precedent, as Hines in 2019 finds the U.S. has intervened in Latin America 56 times. Worryingly, Mora concludes the U.S. military intervention would destroy infrastructure, killings hundreds of thousands, causing upward of 8 million people to flee the country. Tragically, finds that Para finds 90% of the Venezuelans migrate fall into poverty. Moreover, Iber in 2019 warns U.S. intervention would undermine national reconciliation and thus be used as a scapegoat for Maduro, helping him rally support. Thus, we're proud to negate.
Can I call for this evidence?
Yeah, go.
Lopez, 4%. At the bottom.
I can hear you.
Lopez, 4%.
Lopez, okay.
And then can I also see 56?
Yeah.
I see the PDF.
Okay. I have to connect it. What's the other one?
I'm gonna see. Can I see the PDF?
Yeah, I got you. I think it's in the same document. Let me check. No, it's in a different document. Okay, 56. It's from September. Alright, pull it up. Yeah, can you go to Google Drive? I'm not on access. Google Drive, the hard evidence. He uses it. Yeah.
Starting. 9 seconds used total.
Wait, I'm 13.
Oh.
Yeah.
Everyone ready? Okay. Let's talk about Maduro getting out of power. If we can prove that sanctions are ineffective, doesn't this mean, because Trump sees that sanctions are ineffective, that he will have to militarily intervene into Venezuela either way?
No. Can I get a question?
Why not?
Well, one, our evidence at the bottom of the case indicates that sanctions are effective 94% of the time.
Yeah,
two,
but if they're not effective in causing regime change, doesn't that mean see Trump that he's not able to
Well,
uniquely
okay,
cause sanctions to cause
Trump
regime change,
actually,
mean that he has to militarily intervene in
Trump,
Venezuela?
Trump, it doesn't matter whether the Maduro, for our specific argument of regime or intervention, it doesn't matter if Maduro gets in or out of power. What he sees is that sanctions are crippling their economy, and two, making it so
Yeah,
that he
but the
loses
reason as
his
to why we have
votes.
sanctions in the
I
first
mean,
place isn't so
okay,
far as
that-
getting
that may-
Maduro out of
that
power,
may be
right?
true.
So if Trump sees that sanctions aren't working, that means he'll militarily intervene
Yeah,
because
so,
sanctions
yeah,
are, quote,
okay,
ineffective.
If I could answer. So the way he sees sanctions as, I put sanctions on an economy. When he puts sanctions on the economy, he sees that they're choking off the revenue of Maduro. That's why
Yeah.
A, his gold has been down, but B, military officials are deterring. So he sees that sanctions are working.
Sure, but Maduro's not out of power. Go
I
for
mean,
it.
that's fine. Let's go to your argument about like water and thirst.
Yeah.
So on deteriorating infrastructure, your evidence says that it was been deteriorating since 2013. So why didn't they
No.
start implementing reforms then?
Our evidence indicates that prior to sanctions, it was stable, right? The reason as to why they're not able to actually get new water parts is because sanctions uniquely block foreign imports. Can I ask you a question?
So, no. Your evidence says in 2013, there's like corruption and mismanagement, right? So
Doesn't
why
it
weren't
say
they?
it was corruption and mismanagement?
Okay, we can read evidence then. Yeah, sure, that's fine.
Can I ask you a question?
So that still doesn't answer my question, right? So if there was corruption and mismanagement, and there was like water crises occurring in 2013, why didn't they fix the problem then?
We don't say there's water crisis in 2013. We
Okay.
explain that prior to sanctions,
So, but
everything
there-
was stable.
there
That's
was-
the Marco evidence at the top of our case. Can
Alright,
I ask you a
that's fine.
question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Let's talk about this 80% evidence that you explained that Maduro could get out of power in 2020.
Yeah.
Right. So in 2019 and 2017, there was a 70% probability that Maduro was going to get out of power, and now he didn't get out of power in 2019. How can we believe that all of a sudden in 2020 he's going to get out
Two
of power?
responses here. The first is that they didn't predict like certain indicators. One, there are actually three
I mean,
responses.
2019
yeah,
predicted
yeah,
a
yeah.
70%
So
chance.
second,
Why did that
secondly,
happen?
we say that the chance, the fact that it went from 70% to 80% chance increases the
But
chance.
it's
right?
already a high number in
If
2019.
you keep
insofar as
interrupting,
that
if you
didn't
keep
happen.
interrupting me, I can't answer your question.
Okay, go
Yeah.
for it.
All right. Thank you. So in 2019, it was a 70% chance. In 2020, there's an 80% chance. So
Yeah.
what that indicates is that the more we put on sanctions, the more time we have on sanctions, that increases the rate of him getting
Yeah.
out. Two, I would say that military journals are defective.
So what's the methodology of that study, right?
It's a
How does he?
Yeah,
what's
it's a hexagon
What's
study.
a hexagon
So what he
study?
does is he calculates what sanctions do, and then he looks at like 6 different factors. First, he looks at like the military and their defection rate. He looks at the poverty rate in Venezuela. He looks at a bunch
Okay,
of
I think
factors.
you're just making these up. I've read the evidence. It's not those
I mean,
6
if you knew, then
hexagonal
why'd you
factors.
ask?
Alright,
I'm
so
gonna
you can
take
ask
a
the
question.
question.
Yeah, so let's go to the oil, right? So you said that sanctions cut them off from markets, but
Right.
when he was trying to go to the market in like August of 25th in 2017, he was already locked out. So what is
It's
uniquely
sanctions,
yeah,
you said.
that sanctions were passed in
Okay, sure.
October. So in August, when he was trying to go for the oil market, why couldn't he do it then? Like they were in an oil recession, like an oil shock in 2014. Why couldn't he go to the oil market like in 2014 or 2015?
I mean, I'd otherwise that they had increasing oil imports prior to sanctions. The only reason why you changed that is because you cut it off from international markets.
Can we see your link evidence on your C2 on your like first one?
That's is it acts that he considered military action, but then he decided to pursue economic sanctions, or masters that says that the U.S. sees sanctions as a replacement to the military intervention.
Just like your replication.
Okay,
Or replacement.
Are you taking prep time?
Oh, no, sorry.
Oh, there it is. Oh, you want the PDF?
No, no, that's fine. I can read the cover. Oh, okay, that's fine.
Alright.
That's 4 seconds.
Alright, can I look at the PDF?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm starting now. Okay, 2 seconds used there. A minute total.
Alright.
It's gonna go like a weighing overview. You can put it on top of their case and just on their case. Everybody go ahead. Okay. Then let's begin. Water outweighs their case for 3 reasons. First is scope. Renda 19 of CSIS explains that 82% of the population doesn't have access to water. This is why the Guardian 19 explains that spreading across the entire continent at risk of creating a massive epidemic. The longer you wait, the worse the situation gets. That's why you have to affirm right now. Second is actually a prerequisite to the economy, because CSI 19 explains that 28% of students don't attend school because of a lack of water. Reuters 18 explains educators fear an entire lost generation. This acts as a prerequisite to long-term growth because you have to have a transition to skilled industry through high workers. Third is war. Wolf 09 explains water shortages lead to internal instability by forcing mass migration from the countryside to the cities, which leads to violent uprisings. For example, this happened in the Gaza Strip in 1987. This has 2 implications. One, actually a prerequisite to stability, because Wolf 09 explains that such a conflict inevitably causes political instability. Second is scope. Wolf 09 explains this conflict would spill over into surrounding regions as the surface and groundwater deposits often cross international borders. Then, on their first contention, they say by using sanctions, you kick out Maduro by decreasing overall revenue. On both links, there's 5 reasons why Maduro always has revenue. Washington Post in 2020 explains, 1, he has things such as drug trafficking. 2, all of his money is in cryptocurrency. 3, he has illegal log rolling. 4th, his assets abroad. He just sends all of his assets over to Europe and they can't be sanctioned. And 5th, it's when people leave the country, they send money back, he just steals the remittances. The implication of this is Foreign Affairs in 2019 explains that since he survived 2019 with the worst sanctions ever, he's more than ever likely to survive 2020. But then on their individual links, their first one's talking about decreasing gold revenue, but we'd actually say that on net he's actually increasing gold revenue because Dobson explains that to avoid sanctions he's increasing overall gold revenue. This is why Dobson finds that Venezuela in 2019 opened the 5th largest gold mine ever in Venezuela or in Latin America. Then on their second link about increasing political pressure, we would argue that sanctions don't actually increase the high enough cost to actually kick out military people. For example, Cohen 19 explains that generals rather stay penniless in power instead of being put on trial for their crimes. This is why Martin from January 3rd of this year explains major dissenters in the government have either been locked up in jail in the United States or constantly fearing their life in the Colombia or Panama, which has caused the military to lose all faith in Guaido and has stopped any future defectors. We also post all of their evidence about future defections. They're all talking about past defections. But then on their 80% evidence, it's bad for 2 reasons. First, it doesn't actually have any methodology. It just says it's a hexagon model, but the author never tells you how he actually calculates the numbers. It just because there's an increase in protests, that doesn't make a lot of sense why there's all of a sudden an 80% chance. But second, it predicted past numbers to be really high, but he literally just says, quote, in his most recent post that they're talking about, he literally says, quote, it is still guesswork. I don't really know what's going on. But then there's 2 reasons why they make these situation worse. First is civil war. Stratford 19 explains the situation in Venezuela is so far entrenched that if anybody steps out of power, it makes a pro-Maduro group and an anti-Maduro group. We'd say this causes a civil war when Maduro steps down. This also triggers their American intervention because if there's a civil war, America feels like they have to intervene. But second is a worse dictator. The Washington Post finds empirically when the United States has used sanctions to kick out dictators, it only increases the chance that a new worse dictator comes in. For example, we kicked out like some left-wing leader in Chile and just Pinochet came in and like messed stuff up. But then on their reforms argument, Oppenheimer of Miami Herald from this week explains that Venezuela's economy will fall by 10% in 2020 per this evidence because it's from a group of economists from the IMF, ELAC, and other major international businesses compared to their CSI evidence. Also, the reason for this is Sanctions Act is a prerequisite because the New York Times explains sanctions are destroying all investment in the private sector because investors don't want to take the risk that the private sector businesses are affiliated with the government. Then on their second contention about military intervention, we'd argue there's other options, specifically Beaner 19 of USA Today explains that there's always other ways the military intervened. For example, they did nonviolent protests in Colombia as well as Sudan that actually worked in kicking out the military dictator. Then there's three reasons why Trump won't intervene. Specifically, Finnegan 19 of ABC explains Trump would never use the military force in Venezuela because it goes against his campaign to end endless wars abroad. Second, McDonald 19 explains a presidential election that is coming up and Trump would be committing political suicide if he chooses to invade and occupy Venezuela. Then on their the second link about oil, 2 responses. First, Smalls Wars Journal explains shale booms mean that we aren't reliant on foreign oil. This is why this is why, for example, we're not attacking Exxon because we compete with Europe. It just doesn't make sense why we're invading countries with oil. Then on their 2020 links, 2 responses. First, Bremer 19 of Time Magazine is no party. What they align to with the American public favors a policy of less than foreign entanglements. And second, BuzzFeed 19 explains Trump doesn't really need the entire Venezuelan vote. He just needs a small sliver of it. If anybody needed a speech doc, I can send it.
We'll start. That was 50 seconds. So we have a minute and 53 left. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna start on his weighing overview. Go to our argument about reforms and then our second contention in the third case. So Marcus Lucas. Is everyone good? All right. start off on the weighing overview he gives at the top of this about water. That's a really fine and dandy strategy, except he concedes that if we win our second contention about intervention, we actually win the argument about oil, about water. That's because if there's a huge intervention with the entire U.S. military occupying Venezuela, there's no way that they're able to fix infrastructure. Rather, they're going to be destroying more and more infrastructure, meaning that if we win our case on their second contention, we link into water, meaning that the weighing doesn't matter. Go on to our first contention about regime change. We concede that Maduro will always have revenue. There's never going to be a regime change. That kicks out of the two turns about civil war and then a worse dictator in power that they read at the bottom. Go on to our argument about reforms. They read two responses. The first is from Oppenheimer, telling you that there's a 10% decreased economy that's going to happen in 2020. The first argument is that our argument on a 4% increased growth is comparative. That means that you always have to prefer it because it's talking about how much it's increasing from last year. Additionally, post-Dated. But also, that evidence is from the IMF, who also projected that the Venezuelan economy would fall by 35% in the year 2019. A 10% decrease in 2020 is thus an improvement. That's our argument. We're telling you that because of these reforms, the economy is improving. Go to our second contention about intervention. There's a lot of problems with their responses. The first one they read, it's from Bino, telling you that there's other ways for the U.S. to intervene. The argument is that that's not enough for Trump. Trump needs a strong stance. Just because they can support nonviolent protests, that's not enough. Trump's base does not care about nonviolent protests. They care about a strong military response. Then, go on to their next argument. They say that going in would be against his policies of preventing endless wars and would be political suicide. Trump obviously doesn't give a shit. That's why he just invaded Iran. He just started launching attacks on Iran, and there's an increase in escalation right now. Trump's base likes when Trump has a strong foreign policy. That's why they supported him in 2016 for the same reasons. Then on our oil link, they tell you that shale booms mean that they're not relying on other places' oil anymore. That's our argument. Our argument is that Trump specifically wants control of the global oil market, making it rely on U.S. domestic production. It doesn't matter because their response doesn't matter because we're saying that he wants to control Venezuela's oil and make it so they can't export and take control. Then they read that they need a small percent of the Venezuelan vote. Realize that the entire vote in Florida is important. There's a lot of Latinos and most people immigrating from Latin America really like a strong support on Venezuela. Go on for their case. At the top of their first contention, there's a couple problems. Morales finds in 2019 that sanctions aren't actually to blame for the Venezuelan crisis, that there's a lack of public data to realistically estimate the causal effect. What is clear is that the bulk of the Venezuelan deterioration happened prior to the 2017 sanctions. That's because Rendon finds in 2019 that the Venezuelan crisis was caused by Maduro siphoning money from social programs and neglecting millions, restricting their access to food and medicine. Sanctions, however, uniquely choke out Maduro's earnings and weaken his grasp on power. So even if though we're not going for a regime change, we're still weakening his grasp on power, meaning that he can't use the Venezuelan people as much. Go on to their argument about oil. There's a lot of problems here. The first one is that from Elner that finds that there's alternate causations for a plummet in oil prices and revenue, many of which date back to the beginning of the Maduro presidency before sanctions. First, the failure to diversify production and cut dependency on petroleum fueled a crash in global oil prices. Second, the implementation of policies discouraged private investment. And third, the mismanagement of nationalized oil companies under the Maduro administration. And then, Slav finds in December that Venezuela's oil production is actually doubling right now and continuing to grow exponentially thanks to a rebound in exports to India, not the U.S., and that the sanctions are they're flying under the radar of sanctions. Then, you can actually turn the argument against them. As Egan finds in 2019, that sanctions on Venezuela lift the global price of oil by squeezing refineries that rely on Venezuela's huge amount of prior production. That means that the latest rounds of sanctions actually raised oil prices by 3%. That's critical. As Simpson finds in 2019 that high oil prices are the best hope for mass green tech adoption, which prevents climate change, which is an existential threat. Even a small percentage chance of stopping climate change is enough to vote for us. Then, going to the next argument about aid. There's a couple problems here. First, Lee finds in 2019 that Maduro is actually the one blocking aid, pushing millions of people into poverty and not allowing imports in. He's doing that with the U.S. right now. The U.S. is offering aid, but Maduro is not taking in. That means that they don't solve and it's non-unique. Additionally, Sealed finds that the U.S. issued licenses that authorize critical transactions into Venezuela that deliver food, medicine, and other criticals. So there's licenses right now to allow them. In addition, Raposa finds that the only aid being blocked by the U.S. are those headed for sanctioned individuals, not the general public. Go on to thirst. There's a lot of problems here. First, the New York Times finds in December 2019 that the crisis has lasted for decades, yet Maduro never previously made an attempt to fix infrastructure. Additionally, UNICEF is in the region right now, reaching millions from water projects. Additionally, they could get parts from other countries like Russia and China. Also, Maduro has incentive to keep the people impoverished and thirsty because then they're more dependent on him. He won't ever fix water issues, even if sanctions are lifted. That's why he didn't do it before sanctions.
Hold on a little bit.
Wait, so that was 20 seconds?
I had like 50 or so, we can do it in the middle.
Alright. You can take the first question.
Okay, all right. So let's talk about Trump's foreign policy, right? So,
Yes.
what was it in 2016 election?
What was his policy in 2016.
Yeah.
Well, he wasn't president yet. So.
Well, what did he campaign for?
Okay, so what Trump campaigned for was isolationism. So he's basically saying oh, we're gonna be prioritizing America as base ate it up, but at the same time he was prioritizing an increased amount of presence in the Middle East, an increased amount of presence worldwide, and to be strict on authoritarian leaders. That's what Trump did. Trump doesn't follow through what he's saying. He never has. He just says stuff that is base eats up. That's just what's been happening. Can I take a question?
Yeah, sure.
Let's talk about water.
Yeah.
So, what how you tell me that how many people? 20% of Venezuela Venezuelans lack water.
Yeah.
So is this specifically in urban centers or throughout all of Venezuela, rural centers? Where
I'm pretty sure I'd just be talking about the capital.
Just in Caracas?
Yeah.
So your scope is limited to just Caracas?
I mean, yeah, but it gets worse over time. The longer you don't affirm, the worse the water crisis gets because more pipes deteriorate, right? So it just keeps spreading, right?
Caracas is a city with multiple millions of people, right? So
Yeah.
At what scale do the water projects have to be to reach every single person that lacks water in Caracas?
Okay, well, it's they just fixed the pipes. I mean, it's
Fix
not
pipes in every individual home,
Well, no, it's just the main pipes that are the big issue that they're trying to
So-
fix. The ones that are taking it from the river and the large mouths of the river and trying to import it.
Wait, so
but can I have a question, right?
You can go, yeah.
Okay, all right. So let's talk about growth, right?
Mhm.
On your reform argument.
Yep.
So, or actually, no. So if Maduro, so what's the root cause of Trump putting sanctions on Venezuela?
You wanted to weaken Maduro's grasp on power?
Right, or to get Maduro out of power, right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so if Maduro stays in power, does Trump look silly?
No.
Why not?
Because it doesn't matter.
Wait, why doesn't it matter? If Trump's we need to get Maduro out, the best thing that's gonna happen is sanctions,
The goal
right?
of sanctions doesn't really matter, because Trump is trying to appeal to the people who he wants to vote for him, and dude, nobody nobody really knows a lot about Venezuela, Maduro sanctions, the general American public.
Wait.
They just think that there's a dictator in Latin America and Trump has a hard stance on them. He's really getting them good. That's all he wants to do. Can I take a question?
Yeah, sure.
Let's talk about the argument, your oil argument, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so insofar as so you're telling me that we're cutting revenue by $1 billion, or $6 billion so far,
Mhm.
right? And then can you give me the link between cutting revenues by $6 billion and food shortages occurring?
Yeah, all right. So prior to sanctions, the government used the oil revenue to subsidize food and medicine and aid for the poor. The Venezuelan analysis quantifies that was 70%. And when you have less oil revenue, you can't buy food for the poor, so then there's food shortages.
So your argument is that subsidies are going down.
Yeah.
Okay, so did the food necessarily only get did the poor only get food from oil subsidies? Why doesn't
It
Venezuela?
was 70% of oil revenue went.
Okay, so why couldn't they subsidize food from other metrics?
Because
Also,
98% of Venezuela's exports
that-
are oil. Their economy.
Yeah, but they
is
still
made
make a
up of
lot of
oil.
money from oil, right? So why don't they spend the money they make on subsidies? They
It-
still
it's,
make, a
it's
good
cut.
amount of
It's
money.
cut because of sanctions.
We will run crisis started.
Is that all you're saying?
Yeah. gonna start reforms, and then our case, or reforms, their case, our case one. Everyone ready? Okay. On reforms, he says his 4% analysis is comparative, but he missed the analysis that we explained that water is a prerequisite to any sort of economic growth. Insofar as this is true, it's saying because the New York Times explains that sanctions destroy all investment into the private sector because investors don't want to take the risk that the private sector businesses are affiliated with the government. This is really crucial because our front is evidence indicates that even if the Maduro regime were to liberalize price controls, the economy would not improve. That's why you still buy the analysis from the Miami Herald from literally last week. The economy is expected to contract. They missed the analysis that we explained that is a prerequisite because investors will never invest as long as the Maduro regime is still there. Then go to intervention. They say that Trump will never doesn't care about a non-violent protest. No, this is not true because A, it's a political succession. He needs this to actually win the United States election. And B, would explain in past examples, our evidence is really explicit. It says that Venezuela is in the same exact position as Colombia was in. It needs to support non-violent protests. This is really crucial because when you support non-violent protests, it does the exact same as a military intervention without causing that violence. Then go to his 2020 and 2020 argument. We explain that right now there's no reason to do this because it goes against his policy to end endless wars. He say that we just invaded Iran. Obviously, this is not small escalation. Obviously, we have an increased escalation in the long run. But even more so, we'd explain that you only need to have any sort of before his election. We explained that he wasn't going to go endless wars. Obviously, he's not going to do that now. Let's go to our case. At the top, he uses this term that will increase green tax, but we all can see the dealing that oil production is increasing right now. You don't grant access to the return. But then at the top, they say that prior to sanctions, Venezuela's economy was already suffering. Even this is true. Our Martin evidence accounts for this. It explains that U.S. sanctions cut Venezuela off from international markets. This is really crucial because even if growth was slowing prior, sanctions uniquely cut Venezuela off from international markets. But there's two places where you vote for the affirmative team. First is on our aid blockade. The argument is pretty simple. It explains that right now aid is being blocked into Venezuela insofar as Venezuelan companies cannot import pharmaceutical medications. They give two responses. First, they say that Maduro was never letting aid in before, but our Corrales indicates that he was allowing aid twice before sanctions, insofar as it's not true. And during sanctions, you try to get aid into. The reason is simple. He can't get it because sanctions prevent international markets from actually getting into Venezuela. Then he says that Venezuela is getting aid right now. This is not true for three reasons. First, our CNBC evidence indicates that the aid they're talking about only lasted for 1 day. At that way, it's a drop in the bucket. But secondly, and more importantly, it's not as specific to our argument about insulin. Even if there's aid on the borders, the problem is that U.S. pharmaceutical companies are not able to ship insulin to the Venezuelan government. This is where Zurich's evidence case that over 450,000 diabetics are on the brink of death. You weigh this on urgency. As soon as you pull the trigger for the F, over 450,000 Venezuelans get access to aid. Then we would say that in the long term, you actually solve for the crisis better. But then on our subpoint C about quenching thirst, the argument is pretty simple. Prior to sanctions, Venezuela's access to water was stable. Sanctions uniquely prevent this because it prevents foreign parts from actually getting in. But then they say Maduro never made an attempt. Obviously, it's not true. Our Corrales evidence indicates that he tried to buy pumps twice before. Then he said that other countries will fill in. It's not true because our Corrales evidence also indicates that other countries will always fear the secondary sanctions that the United States will always put on, meaning countries like Russia and China have a secondary fear of sanctions being put on them, insofar as they're never going to help Venezuela in the long run. For all those reasons, you should affirm.
Alright, we're gonna run through. Actually, can I see that they cut off from financial markets?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, can I say that the aid from the U.S. lasted for 1 day? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
That they were lying aid twice before.
Yes.
Wait, what was the first one you wanted?
That they cut off from finance.
Oh yeah, sure. Sure.
Yeah, I see it twice, like the line aid twice before.
Or the twice before was from water, but this is specific.
say like Maduro tried to import it in.
Yeah, you said
Yeah.
twice before.
That was for water though.
Oh, okay.
Sorry,
Yeah.
the
Do you want the water?
No, I just wanted to use the line.
Yeah, you said he's trying to get an aid right now. And he
Yeah, it says.
Oh.
Alright, that's fine. Alright, are you good?
Yeah, okay.
Alright, we're starting from.
Yeah. Can I see the non-violent protest?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Alright, we're starting now. Alright.
We're gonna use more.
Here you go.
Sure. It'll be our case first and then their case. Alright, should we give it our case first? Alright, are you all ready?
Yeah.
Alright. Show to the affirmative case, on the negative case. Go to second contention about intervention. I'm not going for a 2020 link. We're going for a dropped link about oil. Remember the second link. Extend the roach evidence, which says that a crucial ulterior motive of U.S. economic sanctions of Venezuela is to gain control of the oil markets. Sanctions act as the U.S. choice of doing so, as Ward in 2019 finds. Prior to sanctions, Trump threatened a military option because Trump perceptually believes Venezuela has an abundant amount of easy access to oil. They drop both the responses, but I'll extend Zane's front lines. They say that they're not reliant and it's not going to work. But that's exactly our argument. He wants to control other people's oil sector so he can push out the U.S.'s domestic production. That's why he wants to control their other oil supplies. That's considered. And secondly, that'll probably also finds our third link about like 2020, because if he gets the U.S. production of oil to increase, that increases his base because they're reliant on white collar jobs, but too oil tycoons start to increase population support. So that also finds their argument. That leads to our argument intervention. They concede all the evidence the Pelagisia evidence, which says that given sanctions are not the U.S. weapon of choice in Venezuela, the alternative would be a military intervention. This is specifically empirically proven. We're winning the probability debate because they can see the Hines evidence, which says that the U.S. had intervened in Latin America 56 times. And worryingly, Mora 19 concludes that U.S. military intervention of Venezuela would destroy infrastructure, killing hundreds of thousands, causing upwards of 8 million to flee the country. Tragically, Parra finds that 90% of these people fall into poverty. This is crucial. We're outweighing their argument for a few reasons. First is on magnitude. We would say that our argument leads to 220,000 people dead and 8 million flee the country. That outweighs their argument. But then secondly, on scope, we would say that it draws in regional actors like Colombia, who are incredibly tied to the U.S. and has a bunch of U.S. troops and aid. But then third, on a prerequisite, we would say that they concede our Mora evidence, which says that the U.S. destroys infrastructure, which means that one, their water argument goes away, but two, we would say that in times of war, the United States would put more pressure and more countries would not want to trade with a war-torn country. But fourth, on time frame, we would say that occupation lasts forever. For example, in Colombia, it lasted 50 years. We're winning this argument, we're winning their case. Now let's go into their argument. on their argument specifically about aid, their evidence ethics is absolutely atrocious. It doesn't say that he allowed aid twice before. They just cross-applied their front line on Maduro accepting water aid. It's not specific to actual aid. They concede that multilateral organizations are going in. For example, UNICEF, they're working there. But two, we would say that they concede our turn on the second on their specific argument about water. The reason why he's declining aid is because he wants to increase dependency on the people. When there's more dependency on the people, that means that they're reliant on Maduro. He wants to keep consolidation of power, which means that he's never going to fully allow aid, even if we lift sanctions, because he wants to create a dependency. But third, we would say that their evidence is bad. But then he said that they're allowing aid, they're not. But secondly, they can see the silk evidence, which says the U.S. put new sanctions, which allowed licenses for food and medicine. They also can see the repose evidence, which says that the United States does not sanction like multilateral organizations. They only targeted certain generals. Go to their argument about thirst. One, they don't extend an impact in summary. But two, they can see that they say that Russia and China have a fear of sanctions. No, Russia owns PDVSA. They're still working with them. But two, we would say that it was happening decades before, and they never attempted to fix. That also goes on aid. We would say that the economic crisis proceeded. It was going down. But then third, they can see that UNICEF is building 22 million water pumps. So yeah, don't watch for it.
You guys ready for cross?
Yeah.
Alright, cool. So, if Trump so does Trump prioritize the election more or oil?
Well, I mean, my front line still applied that if he wins oil.
You're not answering my question. Just does Trump prioritize the election now or oil?
I mean, like they both go hand in hand.
So you're telling me Trump's going to intervene in a country for oil over winning the next election?
We'd say two things.
Yeah,
The first is that we would say him producing his oil sector boosts his support,
Yeah.
one, but two, he ran on an economic platform where if his economy is doing good, that helps.
United
Wait.
States-
Okay, wait. So
Energy
when
independence and, like,
when
oil
is
jobs.
the U.S. economy going down? It's still growing, right?
No, that's not our argument. Is that
Right,
with so many people
so does
working
Trump
in the fossil fuel industry, and with so much of this like lobbying and funding and like donations coming from like oil tycoons and oil companies, if oil is just controlled by the United States, that makes it look so good to people who are in the middle, and additional advertising and funding coming from oil lobbyists who are super happy about this,
Yeah.
basically guarantee a Trump election.
Okay,
Can I
so
take a question?
yeah, sure.
Alright, so let's talk about water.
Yeah.
Actually, let's talk about aid. Like, if you don't since you only weigh water, like, are you what implication
No,
is aid?
Ananth weighs aid on urgency. You
Okay,
guys dropped
okay,
away.
okay.
Wasn't there like a decrease in like our evidence? We didn't like read that part, but there is a
that
decrease.
probably should have been read in this.
Yeah, I'm just asking in general. Wasn't there like an economic decline in Venezuela before?
Okay, you missed the analysis
At the
that
top
even
markets, even if they were
if
declining,
that's true.
Venezuela was cut off from international markets.
Yeah,
That's the
and,
reason as why they're not.
and they were
buying
still
it.
trying. And they were still trying to buy it.
Quick question on specifically what you just said.
Yeah.
Like, why does cutting off for like international financial
Because they're not
markets?
able to import foreign-built pumps.
Yeah.
They're not able to import foreign-built like
Wait, but
medicines.
like
just
financial
stuff.
markets are different from like aid.
Yeah, like one of them is like
Yeah, but,
Yeah,
like,
specifically
trading
from like
each
U.S.
other.
No,
pharmaceuticals.
it's not financial markets, just international markets. They just cannot
Okay,
buy
what is
anything
the
because
difference
of
in a
sanctions.
financial market
Wait,
and an
it's
international
literally
market?
international markets. Okay,
Okay.
but can we have a question?
Yeah, sure.
So back on this oil thing, right? So why hasn't he like intervened in like Europe to take like people's oil?
Europe.
Because he's
Like,
close friends with he hates Maduro, he hates authoritarianism.
Also,
he
Venezuela is
hates-
the largest oil reserve on the
Is it-
planet.
yeah.
Either he wants to be allies with a country who has a lot of oil, or he wants to take control.
Same thing
Okay,
with
wait,
Saudi.
wait, wait,
That's
so
what- that's
is it-
what,
Saudi's
like,
a
fire-
puppet state.
So is it Trump's issue? Like, does Trump like have an issue? Is it uniquely because how Maduro runs the oil?
No, it's
No,
just because they have a lot of them.
They have a
and he
lot of
wants
oil
to-
reserves. Also, they have this thing called butymine, and it's a very.
Oh, wait.
used
So
They
like,
have, like,
so
rare-
hypothetically, if like Guaido was the leader,
No,
like, would he intervene
he wouldn't.
for oil?
No.
He wouldn't intervene, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's because he doesn't like Maduro, right?
That's untrue. I'm just saying.
Wait, no, that's what you
it's-
just said. If Guaido has,
if I
so-
could explain,
yeah.
The argument that we're making is that if Guaido was in power, he could have very easy access to oil because he was the one who put Guaido in power. He would basically have free control over it. It's not that he wants the oil; he wants to control what Venezuela can do with that oil, which he would be under.
Okay, so
Also,
if
like,
Guaido gets instituted, he can control the oil.
Yeah,
you
okay,
know, but not
cool.
once in the round you prove that Guaido is going to be instituted.
Yeah, that's like our argument that we dropped.
Alright,
Yeah,
okay.
we dropped that.
Okay. I'm just gonna go their case, our case, and then Wayne. Is everybody ready?
Yep.
Oh, actually, I'm gonna respond to their case, or their way, like their magnitude scope. Yeah. All right. Everybody ready?
Yep.
Okay. Then let's begin. on the weighing, they say in summary, we would say that AF has fiat instantly when you actually affirm the reason is because you instantly pull off sanctions. We would say this is the best way to actually let the people have aid. We would say in the long term, escalation takes a very long time to step up the escalation ladder. However, instantly when you affirm, you allow 450,000 people to actually get medicine. This acts as a prereq to all of their arguments because the longer you wait, the worse it gets. That's the urgency weighing that they concede. But then on their second contention about the Independence Day, they say by using U.S. sanctions, it prevents Trump from intervening. There's two key issues here. First, they drop the non-violent, they just poorly mishandle the non-violent intervention response. We would say this is the best way for Trump to control the oil industry because if he kicks out Guaido, the person that he hates, it's a better way to control. But B, it's the most politically popular way for Trump to actually intervene. But moreover, even if it's true that he wants to intervene in oil, I would argue that the reason why he won't do it is because of the elections. They dropped that analysis that we explained that Trump's foreign policy has been to end endless wars. This is the unique reasoning why he won't intervene. Moreover, we tell you historically when a Trump has when the president has actually intervened or caused death, it's decreased his chance of actually winning an election. But then, on our case, specifically on our subpoint B about aid blockade, our argument is because the U.S. sanctions block medicine, it prevents U.S. pharmaceutical companies from selling the drugs, and U.S. banks are forced to refuse Venezuelan payments. This is why 450,000 people are on the brink of death. If you don't affirm, this is probably the cleanest place to vote. They give a couple responses. One, they tell you there's other aid being let in, but they miss the analysis Anant makes that it's only a drop in the bucket and only lasts for 1 day. The best way to actually account for the insulin that's not getting in, because all of their evidence is just talking about general aid like food, but our evidence is specific to diabetics. They're on the brink of death. That is why you have to affirm for us. But second, they tell you Maduro was blocking the aid and he wants it to keep it weak for the people. But this is ahistoric. We tell you in summary that he was already trying to buy the parts in medicine to actually save the people. But then on our subpoint C about quenching thirst, our argument is Venezuela's been cut off from international markets and they can't repair their old pipes. They give two responses. They would say the crisis lasted for decades. Even if that's true, you can still reform the pipes. Second is secondary sanctions, but that doesn't really matter. But the important thing is that 1 million people are at the risk of death if you do not affirm for us.
It's going to be our argument about oil intervention, weighing, and in their case. Okay. Is everybody ready? Start off on our second contention about intervention, specifically our link about oil. The only response that he makes in the entire round is this the idea that there's other ways to intervene, for example, nonviolent protests. There's a couple problems here. First, he tells you that through nonviolent protests, Trump can control oil. That implication isn't made until first final focus. Regardless, we looked at their evidence. Their evidence never says that this option is popular, nor does it say that it's a hardline stance. Our argument is specifically that it needs to go in physically in order to actually enact control over the region. They never responded to that once. It's the easiest place to vote in the round. Then they say that it goes against his political message and his political suicide. However, they drop the response that Ali makes in summary that productivity increases in production increases of oil and more oil control makes Trump's base a lot more happier. A, because a lot of them work in fossil fuels and it's a huge industry in America. And B, because a lot of his funding comes from oil tycoons who will invest more into advertising and lobbying for the Trump regime. That means it gives us clean access to an argument about oil. Remember that right now, Trump really wants to enact control over the global oil market, and the best way to do that is to target the places where oil reserves are the highest in the entire world. That means that he goes into Venezuela and attacks, but sanctions are stopping him because he's able to control Venezuelan oil exports through sanctions. But without sanctions, he has to go in. That's the only way he can enact control. That's one of his biggest priorities. That's really important and has a historical precedence. As a U.S. has intervened 56 times in Latin America, that gives us the probability. Let's talk about weighing. They tell you that AF has instant fiat and final focus and people need to get aid. First of all, that's new in final focus. But second of all, they tell you that escalation takes a while and that their arguments are more urgent. Even if that's true, you should always go to our evidence, our arguments first. Remember first, on the magnitude, we tell you that 220,000 people died the last time the U.S. invaded a Latin American country, and specifically in Venezuela, 8 million people are projected to flee. Additionally, on scope, because it will take regional actors in, on time frame, because it's a long occupation, and lastly, on prerequisite, because it would destroy infrastructure through an intervention. That means that they don't get access to their arguments on thirst and also on medicine. Remember that when there's more pressure in wartime, it leads to less imports. Let's go into their arguments on their case real quick. The biggest issue with their arguments is they can see the analysis that we made in every speech. The Maduro always has an incentive to keep the people in Venezuela impoverished and thirsty because then they're more dependent on him. That means that when we lift sanctions, they have they're able to that means that they're not going to be able to lift sanctions. That means that even if you lift sanctions, they're not going to be getting it better. Vote for the impact with the most weighing on it.